3. To do justice to Freud, The History of Madness in the Age of Psychoanalysis by Jacques Derrida. Resistances of Psychoanalysis to the memory of Georges Canguilhem when Elizabeth Raldinesco and René Major did me the honor and kindness of inviting me to a commemoration that would also be a reflection to one of these genuine tributes where thought is conditioned by fidelity and fidelity honed by thought. I did not hesitate for one moment. Above all, because I love memory. This is nothing original, of course, and yet, how else can one love? Indeed, 30 years ago this great book of Foucault was an event whose repercussions were so intense and multiple that I will not even try to identify, much less measure, them deep inside me. Next, because I love friendship, and the trusting affection that Foucault showed me 30 years ago, which was to last for many years, was all the more precious in that, being shared, it corresponded to my professed admiration for him. Then, after 1972, what came to obscure this friendship, without, however, affecting my admiration, was not in fact alien to this book, and to a certain debate that ensued or at least to its distant, delayed, and indirect effects. There was in all of this a sort of dramatic chain of events, a compulsive and repeated precipitation that I do not wish to describe here because I do not wish to be alone, to be the only one to speak of this after the death of Michel Foucault, except to say that this shadow that made us invisible to one another, that made us not associate with one another for close to 10 years, until the 1st of January 1982, when I returned from a Czech prison, is still part of a story that I love like life itself. It is part of a story or history that is related, and that by the same token relates me, to the book we are commemorating here, to something like its postface, one of its postfaces, since the drama I just alluded to arose out of a certain postface, even out of a sort of postscript added by Foucault to a postface in 1972. While accepting wholeheartedly this generous invitation, I nonetheless declined the accompanying suggestion that I return to the discussion that began some 28 years ago. I declined for numerous reasons, the first being the one I just mentioned, one does not carry on a stormy discussion after the other has departed. Second, because this whole thing is more than overdetermined, so many difficult and intersecting texts Descartes, Foucault, so many objections and responses, from me but also from all those, in France and elsewhere, who later came to act as arbiters, it has become too distant from me, and perhaps because of the drama just alluded to I no longer wish to return to it. In the end, the debate is archived and those who might be interested can analyze it as much as they want and decide for themselves. By rereading all the texts of this discussion, right up to the last word, and especially the last word, one will better be able to understand, I imagine, why I prefer not to give it a new impetus today. There is no privileged witness for such a situation which, moreover, can only ever take form with the possible disappearance of the witness already at the origin. This is perhaps one of the meanings of any history of madness, one of the problems for any project or discourse concerning a history of madness, or even a history of sexuality. Is there any witnessing to madness? Who can witness? Does witnessing mean seeing? Is it to provide a reason, render a raison? Does it have an object? Is there any object? Is there a possible third that might provide a reason without objectifying, or even identifying, that is to say, without examining, a raisonner? Though I have decided not to return to what was debated close to 30 years ago, it would nevertheless be absurd, obsessional to the point of pathological, to say nothing of impossible, to give in to a sort of fetishistic denial and to think that I can protect myself from any contact with the place or meaning of this discussion. Although I intend to speak today of something else altogether, starting from a very recent rereading of the history of madness in the classical age, I am not surprised, and you will probably not be either, to see the silhouette of certain questions re-emerge, not their content, of course, to which I will in no way return, but their abstract type, the schema or spectre of an analogous problematic. If I speak not of Descartes but of Freud, for example, if I thus avoid a figure who seems central to this book and who, because he is decisive as regards its center or centering of perspective, emerges right from the early pages on, right from the first border or approach, one if I thus avoid this Cartesian reference in order to move toward another, psychoanalysis, Freudian or some other, that is evoked only on the edges of the book and is named only right near the end, or ends, on the other border, this will perhaps be once again in order to pose a question that will resemble the one that imposed itself upon me 30 years ago, namely, that of the very possibility of a history of madness. The question will be, in the end, about the same, though it will be posed from another border, and it still imposes itself upon me as the first tribute owed such a book. If this book was possible, if it had from the beginning and retains today a certain monumental value, the presence and undeniable necessity of a monument, that is, of what imposes itself by recalling and cautioning, it must tell us, teach us, or ask us something about its own possibility. About its own possibility today, yes, we are saying today, a certain today. Whatever else one may think of this book, whatever questions or reservations it might inspire in those who come at it from some other point of view, its path-breaking force seems incontestable. Just as incontestable as the law according to which all path-breaking opens the way only at a certain price, only, that is, by bolting shut other passages, by ligaturing, stitching up, or compressing, indeed repressing, at least provisionally, other veins. And so today, like yesterday, I mean in March of 1963, this question of the today is important to me, the question I tried to formulate yesterday. I ask you to pardon me this once, then, since I will not make a habit of it, for citing a few lines that then defined, in its general form, a task that seems to me still necessary, on the side of, do quote the, Freud this time rather than on the side of Descartes. By saying on the side of Freud rather than on the side of Descartes, let us not give in too quickly to the knife that would precipitate us into believing that we are closer to a today with Freud than with Descartes, though this is the opinion of most historians. Here, then, is the question of yesterday, of the today of yesterday, as I would translate it today, on the side of Freud, transporting it in this way into the today of today. Therefore, if Foucault's book, despite all the acknowledged impossibilities and difficulties, acknowledged by him, of course, was capable of being written, we have the right to ask what, in the last resort, supports this language without recourse or support, without recourse and without support are expressions of Foucault that I had just cited, who enunciates the possibility of non-recourse. Who wrote and who is to understand, in what language and from what historical situation of logos, who wrote and who is to understand this history of madness. For it is not by chance that such a project could take shape today. Without forgetting, quite to the contrary, the audacity of Foucault's act in the history of madness, we must assume that a certain liberation of madness has gotten underway, that psychiatry has opened itself up, however minimally, and, in the end, I would be tempted simply to replace psychiatry by psychoanalysis in order to translate the today of yesterday into the today of my question of today, and that the concept of madness as unreason, if it ever had a unity, has been dislocated. And that a project such as Foucault's can find its historical origin and passageway in the opening produced by this dislocation. If Foucault, more than anyone else, is attentive and sensitive to these kinds of questions, it nevertheless appears that he does not acknowledge their quality of being prerequisite methodological or philosophical considerations. 2. If this type of question made any sense or had any legitimacy, if the point was then to question that which, today, in this time that is ours, this time in which Foucault's History of Madness was written, made possible the event of such a discourse, it would have been more appropriate for me to elaborate this problematic on the side of modernity, a party subjecti, in some sense, on the side where the book was written, thus on the side, for example, of what must have happened to the modern psychiatry mentioned in the passage I just read. To modern psychiatry or, indeed, to psychoanalysis, or rather to psychoanalysis or psychoanalysts, since the passage to the plural will be precisely what is at stake in this discussion. It would have thus been more imperative to insist on modern psychiatry or psychoanalysis than to direct the same question toward Descartes. To study the place and role of psychoanalysis in the Foucauldian project of a history of madness, as I am now going to try to do, might thus consist in correcting an oversight or in confronting more directly a problematic that I had left in a preliminary stage, as a general, programmatic frame, in the introduction to my lecture of 1963. That lecture made only one allusion to psychoanalysis. It is true, however, that it inscribed it from the very opening. In a protocol that laid out certain reading positions, I spoke of the way in which philosophical language is rooted in non-philosophical language, and I recalled a rule of hermeneutical method that still seems to me valid for the historian of philosophy as well as for the psychoanalyst, namely, the necessity of first ascertaining a surface or manifest meaning and, thus, of speaking the language of the patient to whom one is listening, the necessity of gaining a good understanding, in a quasi-scholastic way, philologically and grammatically, by taking into account the dominant and stable conventions of what Descartes meant on the already so difficult surface of his text, such as it is interpretable according to classical norms of reading, the necessity of gaining this understanding before submitting the first reading to a symptomatic and historical interpretation regulated by other axioms or protocols, before and in order to destabilize, wherever this is possible and if it is necessary, the authority of canonical interpretations. Whatever one ends up doing with it, one must begin by listening to the canon. It is in this context that I recalled Ferenczi's remark cited by Freud in the interpretation of dreams. Every language has its own dream language, and Lagac's observations concerning polyglotism and analysis. 3 In its general and historical form, my question concerned the site that today gives rise to a history of madness and thereby makes it possible. Such a question should have led me, it is true, toward the situation of psychiatry and psychoanalysis rather than toward a questioning of the reading of Descartes. This logic would have seemed more natural, and the consequence more immediate. But if, in so strictly delimiting the field, I substituted Descartes for Freud, it was perhaps not only because of the significant and strategic place that Foucault confers upon the Cartesian moment in the interpretation of the Great Confinement and of the Classical Age, that is to say, in the layout of the very object of the book, it was already, at least implicitly, because of the role that the reference to a certain Descartes played in the thought of that time, in the early 60s, as close as possible to psychoanalysis, in the very element, in truth, of a certain psychoanalysis and Lacanian theory. This theory developed around the question of the subject and the subject of science. Whether it was a question of anticipated certainty and logical time, 1945, in Ecritz, or, some years later, 1965-66, of the role of the cogito and precisely of the deceitful God in La Science it la Vérité, Lacan returned time and again to a certain unsurpassability of Descartes. 4 In 1945, Lacan associated Descartes with Freud in his Proposal La Causalité Psychique and concluded by saying that neither Socrates, nor Descartes, nor Marx, nor Freud, can be surpassed insofar as they led their research with this passion for unveiling whose object is the truth. 5 The title I have proposed for the few reflections I will risk today, The History of Madness in the Age of Psychoanalysis, clearly indicates a change in tense, in mode, or in voice. It is no longer a question of the age described by a history of madness. It is no longer a question of an epoch or period, such as the classical age, that would, inasmuch as it is its very object, stand before the history of madness as Foucault writes it. It is a question today of the age to which the book itself belongs, the age out of which it takes place, the age that provides its situation. It is a question of the age that is describing rather than the age that is described. In my title, The History of Madness must be in quotation marks since the title designates the age of the book, the history, Historia Rerum Vegeterum, of madness as a book in the age of psychoanalysis and not the history, res gesta, of madness itself, in the age of psychoanalysis, even though, as we will see, Foucault regularly attempts to objectify psychoanalysis and to reduce it to that of which he speaks rather than times to that out of which he speaks. What will interest me will thus be the time and historical conditions in which the book is rooted, those that it takes as its point of departure, and not so much the time or historical conditions that it recounts and tries in a certain sense to objectify. Were one to trust too readily in the opposition between subject and object, as well as in the category of objectification, something that I here believe to be neither possible nor just, and hardly faithful to Foucault's own intention, one would say for the sake of convenience that it is a question of considering the history of madness a party subjecti, that is, from the side where it is written or inscribed and not from the side of what it describes. Now, from the side where this history is written, there is, of course, a certain state of psychiatry as well as psychoanalysis. Would Foucault's project have been possible without psychoanalysis, with which it is contemporary and of which it speaks little and in such an equivocal or ambivalent manner in the book? Does the project owe psychoanalysis anything? What? Would the debt, if it had been contracted, be essential? Or would it, on the contrary, define the very thing from which the project had to detach itself, in a critical fashion, in order to take shape? In a word, what is the situation of psychoanalysis at the moment of, and with respect to, Foucault's book? And how does this book situate its project with respect not only to psychoanalysis in general, but to a particular psychoanalysis, at a particular phase of its history, in one or another of its figures? Let us put our trust for a moment in this common name, psychoanalysis. And let us delay a bit the arrival of proper names, for example, Freud or Lacan, and provisionally assume that there is indeed a psychoanalysis that is a single whole, as if it were not, already in Freud, sufficiently divided to make its localization and identification more than problematic. Yet the very thing whose coming due we are here trying to delay will no doubt form the very horizon, in any case the provisional conclusion, of this talk. Foucault speaks little of Freud in this book. This may seem justified, on the whole, by the delimitation that a historian of madness in the classical age must impose upon himself if one accepts the great caesura of this layout, even though this raises a swarm of questions, which I prudently, and by economy, avoid in order to get a better grasp on what Foucault means by Freud, situating myself, therefore, within the thesis or hypothesis of the partition between a classical and a post-classical age. Then Freud does not have to be treated. He can and must be located, at most, on the borderline. The borderline is never a secure place, it never forms an indivisible line, and it is always on the border that the most disconcerting problems of topology get posed. Where, in fact, would a problem of topology get posed if not on the border? Would one ever have to worry about the border if it formed an indivisible line? A borderline is, moreover, not a place per se. It is always risky, particularly for the historian, to assign to whatever happens on the borderline, to whatever happens between sites, the taking place of a determinable event. Now, Foucault does and does not want to situate Freud in a historical place that is stabilizable, identifiable, and open to a univocal understanding. The interpretation or topography of the Freudian moment with which he presents us is always uncertain, divided, mobile, some would say ambiguous, others ambivalent, confused, or contradictory. Sometimes he wants to credit Freud, sometimes discredit him, unless he is actually doing both indiscernibly and at the same time. One will always have the choice of attributing this ambivalence to either Foucault or Freud. It can characterize a motivation, the gesture of the interpreter and a certain state of his work, but it can also, or in the first place, refer simply to the interpreter or historian's taking account of a structural duplicity that his work reflects from the thing itself, namely, from the event of psychoanalysis. The motivation would thus be justly motivated, it would be just that motivated, it would be called for and justified by the very thing that is in question. For the ambiguity of which we are going to speak could indeed be on the side of psychoanalysis, on the side of the event of this invention named psychoanalysis. Other hinge today to begin, let us indicate a few telling signs. If most of the explicit references to Freud are grouped in the conclusions of the book, at the end of the birth of the asylum and in the beginning of the anthropological circle, 6 what I would here call a charnière, a hinge, comes earlier on, right in the middle of the volume, to divide at once the book and the book's relation to Freud. Why a charnière? This word can be taken in the technical or anatomical sense of a central or cardinal articulation, a hinge pin, cardo, or pivot. A charnière or hinge is an axial device that enables the circuit, the trope, or the movement of rotation. But one might also dream a bit in the vicinity of its homonym, that is, in line with this other artifact that the code of falconry also calls a charnière, the place where the hunter attracts the bird by laying out flesh as a lure. This double articulation, this double movement or alternation between opening and closing that is assured by the workings of a hinge, this coming and going, indeed this fortolder of a pendulum, pendule, or balancer, that is what Freud means to Foucault. And this technico-historical hinge also remains the place of a possible simulacrum or lure for both the body and the flesh. Taken at this level of generality, things will never change for Foucault. There will always be this interminable, alternating movement that successively opens and closes, draws near and distances, rejects and accepts, excludes and includes, disqualifies and legitimates, masters and liberates. The Freudian place is not only the technico-historical apparatus, the artifact called charnière hinge. Freud himself will in fact take on the ambiguous figure of a doorman or doorkeeper, who is ushering in a new epoch of madness, our epoch, the one out of which is written the history of madness, the book bearing this title. Freud also represents the best guardian of an epoch that comes to a close with him, the history of madness such as it is recounted by the book bearing this title. Freud is the doorman of the today, the holder of the keys, of those that open as well as those that close the door, that is, the who is, onto the today, or Joward hui, or onto madness. He, Louis, Freud, is the double figure of the door or the doorkeeper. He stands guard and ushers in. Alternatively or simultaneously, he closes one epoch and opens another. And as we will see, this double possibility is not alien to an institution, to what is called the analytic situation as a scene behind closed doors, who is close. That is why and this would be the paradox of a serial law Freud does and does not belong to the different series in which Foucault inscribes him. What is outstanding, outside the series, whole series, turns out to be regularly reinscribed within different series. I am not now going to get involved in formal questions concerning a quasi-transcendental law of seriality that could be illustrated in an analogous way by so many other examples, each time, in fact, that the transcendental condition of a series is also, paradoxically, a part of that series, creating a bias for the constitution of any set or whole, ensemble, particularly, of any historical configuration, age, episteme, paradigm, themata, epoch, and so on. These agorias are anything but accidental impasses that one should try to force at all costs into received theoretical models. The putting to the test of these agorias is also the chance of thinking. To keep to the contract of this conference, I will restrict myself to a single example. The first sign comes right in the middle of the book, pp 19798, f, pp 410-11. It comes at the end of the second part, in the chapter entitled Doctors and Patients. We have there a sort of epilogue, less than a page and a half long, separated from the conclusion by asterisks. The epilogue also signals the truth of a transition and the meaning of a passage. It seems to be firmly structured by two unequivocal statements. One, psychology does not exist in the classical age. It does not yet exist. Foucault says this without hesitation right at the beginning of the epilogue. In the classical age, it is futile to try to distinguish physical therapeutics from psychological medications, for the simple reason that psychology did not exist. 2. But as for the psychology that was to be born after the classical age, psychoanalysis would not be a part, it would no longer be a part. Foucault writes, it is not psychology that is involved in psychoanalysis. In other words, if in the classical age there is not yet psychology, there is, in psychoanalysis, already no more psychology. But in order to affirm this, it is necessary, on the one hand, to resist a prejudice or a temptation, to resist that which continues to urge so many interpreters of good sense, and sometimes, in part, Foucault among them, to take psychoanalysis for a psychology, however original or new it may be. Foucault is going to show signs of this resistance, as we will see. But it is also necessary, on the other hand, to accept, within this historical schema, the hypothesis of a return, not the return to Freud but the return of Freud to. What return? Return to what? Return is Foucault's word, an underscored word. If psychoanalysis is already no longer a psychology, does it not, at least in this respect, seem to suggest a certain return to the time when psychology was not yet? Beyond 18th century psychology and, very broadly, beyond the psychologistic modernity of the 19th century, beyond the positivist institution of psychology, does it not seem as if Freud were joining back up with a certain classical age or at least with whatever in this age does not determine madness as a psychical illness but as unreason, that is, as something that has to do with reason? In the classical age, if such a thing exists, a hypothesis of Foucault that I take here, in this context, as such, as if it were not debatable, unreason is no doubt reduced to silence, one does not speak with it. One interrupts or forbids dialogue, and this suspension or interdiction would have received from the Cartesian cogito the violent form of a sentence. For Freud too madness would be unreason, and in this sense, at least, there would be a neo-Cartesian logic at work in psychoanalysis. But this time one should resume speaking with it, one would re-establish a dialogue with unreason and lift the Cartesian interdiction. Like the word return, the expression dialogue with unreason is a quotation. The two expressions scan a final paragraph of this epilogue, in the middle of the book, that begins with the phrase with which I entitled this talk, we must do justice to Freud, p. 198, f, p. 411. When one says one must do justice one has to be fair, ill-fouted to just one, it is often with the intention of correcting an impulse or reversing the direction of a tendency, one is also recommending resisting a temptation. Foucault must have felt this temptation, the temptation to do an injustice to Freud, to be unfair to him that is, in this case, to write him into the age of the psychopathological institution, which we will define in a moment. He must have felt it outside or within himself. Indeed, such a temptation must still be threatening and liable to re-emerge, since it is still necessary to call for vigilance and greater justice. Here, then, is the paragraph, which I read in extenso, since its internal tension determines, it seems to me, the matrix of all future statements about psychoanalysis. It determines them in the very oscillation of their movement back and forth. It is like the scales of a justice, la balance de injustice, that not even the death sentence, a writ de mort, could stop, a reiterate, in an even or just stability. It is as if justice were to remain its own movement. This is why we must do justice to Freud. Between Freud's 5 case histories and Janet's scrupulous investigations of psychological healing, there is more than the density of a discovery, there is the sovereign violence of a return. Janet enumerated the elements of a division, drew up his inventory, annexed here and there, perhaps conquered. Freud went back to madness at the level of its language, reconstituted one of the essential elements of an experience reduced to silence by positivism. He did not make a major addition to the list of psychological treatments for madness. He restored, in medical thought, the possibility of a dialogue with unreason. Let us not be surprised that the most psychological of medications has so quickly encountered its converse and its organic confirmations. It is not psychology that is involved in psychoanalysis, but precisely an experience of unreason that it has been psychology's meaning, in the modern world, to mask. P 198, F, P times 428 to mask. Positivist psychology would thus have masked the experience of unreason, an imposition of the mask, a violent dissimulation of the face, of truth or of visibility. Such violence would have consisted in disrupting a certain unity, which corresponded precisely, justement, to the presumed unity of the classical age. From then on, there would be, on the one hand, illness of an organic nature and, on the other, unreason, an unreason often tempered by this modernity under its epithetic form, the unreasonable, whose discursive manifestations will become the object of a psychology. 9 This psychology then loses all relation to a certain truth of madness, that is, to a certain truth of unreason. Psychoanalysis, on the contrary, breaks with psychology by speaking with the unreason that speaks within madness and, thus, by returning through this exchange of words, not to the classical age itself which also determined madness as unreason, but, unlike psychology, did so only in order to exclude or confine it but toward this eve of the classical age, which still haunted it. While this schema is firmly established by the page just cited, I was struck in rereading the history of madness by a paradox in the form of a chiasmus. I had not, in my first reading, given it the attention it deserves. What is the schema of this chiasmus? By reason of what we have just heard, in order to do justice to Freud we ought to give him credit for figuring as he does occasionally the gallery of all those who, from one end of the book to the other, announce, like heralds of good tidings, the very possibility of the book, above all Nietzsche and, most frequently, Nietzsche and Artaud, who are often associated in the same sentence Nietzsche, Artaud, Van Gogh, sometimes Nerval, and Hölderlin from time to time. Their excess, the madness in which the work of art is engulfed is the gulf or abyss out of which opens the space of our enterprise. P 288, F, P 643. It is before this madness, in the fleeting moment when it is joined to the work, that we are responsible. We are far from being able to arraign it or make it appear, for it is we who must appear before it. Let us recognize, then, that we are responsible before it rather than being authorized to examine it, a reasoner, to objectify and demand an explanation from it. At the end of the last page, after having spent a good deal of time speaking of Nietzsche and after having mentioned Van Gogh, Foucault writes, the moment when, together, the work of art and madness are born and fulfilled is the beginning of the time when the world finds itself arraigned by that work of art and responsible before it for what it is. P 289, F, P 643. This is, in sum, what the history of madness, in responding to the summons, takes note of and assumes responsibility for. It assumes responsibility before that which is named by the names of Nietzsche and all these others who, as everyone knows, were deemed crazy by society, Artaud, and before him Van Gogh, and before him Nerval, and before him Hölderlin. But what about Freud? Why is he, in the same book, sometimes associated with and sometimes opposed to these great witnesses of madness and excess, these great witnesses who are also great judges, our judges, those who judge us? Must we be arraigned before Freud? And why do things then get complicated? I would see the chiasmus of which I just spoke in a place where Freud is in fact found near Nietzsche, on the same side as he, that is, on our side, on the side of what Foucault calls contemporary man, this enigmatic we for whom a history of madness opens today, cracks open the door of today, who is D or Joward Hui, so that its possibility may be glimpsed. Foucault has just described the loss of unreason, the background against which the classical age determined madness. It is the moment when unreason degenerates or disappears into the unreasonable, it is the tendency to pathologize, so to speak, madness. And there again, it is through a return to unreason, this time without exclusion, that Nietzsche and Freud reopen the dialogue with madness itself, assuming, along with Foucault, that one can hear say itself. This dialogue had, in a sense, been broken off twice, and in two different ways, the second time by yesterday's psychological positivism, which no longer conceived of madness as unreason, the first time by the classical age, which, while excluding madness and breaking off the dialogue with it, still determined it as unreason and excluded it precisely because of this but excluded it as close as possible to itself, as its other and its adversary. The latter is the Cartesian moment, such as it is determined, at least, in the 3 pages that were the object of our debate nearly 30 years ago. I will underscore everything that marks the today, the present, the now, the contemporary, this time that is proper and common to us, the time of this fragile and divided we from which is decided the possibility of a book like The History of Madness, decided while scarcely being sketched out, while promising itself, in short, rather than giving itself over. Nietzsche and Freud are conjoined, conjugated, like a couple, Nietzsche and Freud, and the conjunction of their coupling is also the copula hinge or, if you prefer, the middle term of the modern proposition, if contemporary man, since Nietzsche and Freud, finds deep within himself the sight for contesting all truth, being able to read, in what he now knows of himself, the signs of fragility through which unreason threatens, 17th century man, on the contrary, discovers, in the immediate presence of his thought to itself, the certainty in which reason in its pure form is announced. F. pp 195-96, 2. The evil genius of the chiasmus. Why did I speak of the chiasmus? And why would we be fascinated by the multiple chiasmus that organizes this entire interpretative scene? It is because, in the 3 pages devoted to Descartes at the beginning of the 2nd chapter, The Great Confinement, Foucault spoke of an exclusion. He described it, posed it, declared it unequivocally and firmly, madness is excluded by the subject who doubts. This exclusion was the result of a decision, the result, and these are all his words, of a strange act of force that was going to reduce to silence the excluded madness and trace a very strict line of division. In the part of the meditations that he cited and focused on, Foucault left out all mention of the evil genius. It was thus in recalling the hyperbolic raising of the stakes in the fiction of the evil genius that I then confessed my perplexity and proposed other questions. When Foucault responds to me 9 years later in the afterword to the 1972 Gallimard edition of The History of Madness, he still firmly contests the way I used this Cartesian fiction of the evil genius and this hyperbolic moment of doubt. He accuses me of erasing everything that shows that the episode of the evil genius is an exercise that is voluntary, controlled, mastered, and carried out from start to finish by a meditating subject who never lets himself be surprised. F. P. 6 or 10. Such a reproach was indeed unfair, unjust, since I had stressed that this methodical mastery of the voluntary subject is almost always at work and that Foucault, therefore, like Descartes, is almost always right. A raison, and almost always wins out over a raison d'être. The evil genius 11, but that is not what is at issue here, and I said that I would not reopen the debate. By accusing me of erasing this methodical neutralization of the evil genius, Foucault once again in his response of 1972 confirms the claims of the 3 pages in question and maintains that if the evil genius again takes on the powers of madness, this is only after the exercise of meditation has excluded the risk of being mad. 12. One might be tempted to respond that if the evil genius can again take on these powers of madness, if he once again takes them on afterwards, after the fact, it is because the exclusion of the risk of being mad makes way for an after. The narrative is thus not interrupted during the exclusion alleged by Foucault, an exclusion that is, up to a certain point at least, attested to and incontestable, and I never in fact contested this exclusion in this regard. Quite the contrary, neither the narrative nor the exercise of the meditation that it retraces are any more interrupted than the order of reasons is definitively stopped by this same exclusion. But let us move on. As I said earlier, I am not invoking this difficulty in order to return to an old discussion. I am doing it because Freud is going to be, as I will try to show, doubly situated, twice implicated in the chiasmus that interests me. On the one hand, the sentence that I cited a moment ago, where Freud was immediately associated with Nietzsche, the only one to be associated with him, on the good side, so to speak, on the side where we contemporaries reopen the dialogue with unreason that was twice interrupted, is followed by a few references to the evil genius that complicate, as I myself had tried to do, the reading of the scene of Cartesian doubt as the moment of the great confinement. On the other hand, I will later try, in a more indirect way, and this will be the essence of my talk today, to recall the necessity of taking into account a certain evil genius of Freud, namely, the presence of the demonic, the devil, the devil's advocate, the limping devil, and so on in beyond the pleasure principle, where psychoanalysis finds, it seems to me, its greatest speculative power but also the place of greatest resistance to psychoanalysis, death drive, repetition compulsion, and so on. And fought. Thus, just after having spoken of contemporary man, since Nietzsche and Freud, Foucault offers a development on the subject of the evil genius. The logic of this sequence seems to me guided by a one must not forget that I would be tempted to relate to the one must do justice of a moment ago. What must one not forget? The evil genius, of course, justament. And especially, I emphasize, the fact that the evil genius is anterior to the cogito, so that its threat remains perpetual. This might contradict, as I had attempted to do, the thesis argued 150 pages earlier on the subject of the Cartesian cogito as the simple exclusion of madness. This could have, as a result, indeed this should have, spared us a long and dramatic debate. But it is too late now. Foucault reaffirms all the same, despite the recognized anteriority of the evil genius, that the cogito is the absolute beginning, even if, in this absolute beginning, one must not forget what has, in short, been forgotten or omitted in the discourse on the exclusion of madness by the cogito. The question thus still remains what a methodically absolute beginning would be that does not let us forget this anterior and, moreover, perpetual threat, nor the haunting backdrop that first lets it appear. As always, I prefer to cite, even though it is a long passage. Here is what Foucault says immediately after having evoked the contemporary man who since Nietzsche and Freud meets in what he now knows of himself that through which unreason threatens. He says, in effect, that what is called contemporary had already begun in the classical age and with the evil genius, which clearly, to my eyes at least, cannot leave intact the historical categories of reference and the presumed identity of something like the classical age, for example. But this does not mean that classical man was, in his experience of the truth, more distanced from unreason than we ourselves might be. It is true that the cogito is the absolute beginning. This statement thus confirms the thesis of F. EP 54-57, but one must not forget, my emphasis, that the evil genius is anterior to it. And the evil genius is not the symbol in which are summed up and systematized all the dangers of such psychological events as dream images and sensory errors. Between God and man, the evil genius has an absolute meaning. He is in all his rigor the possibility of unreason and the totality of its powers. He is more than the refraction of human finitude, well beyond man. He signals the danger that could prevent man once and for all from gaining access to the truth. He is the main obstacle, not of such a spirit but of such reason. And it is not because the truth that gets illuminated in the cogito ends up entirely masking the shadow of the evil genius that one ought to forget its perpetually threatening power. My emphasis, Foucault had earlier said that one must not forget that the evil genius is anterior to the cogito, and he now says that one must not forget its perpetually threatening power, even after the passage, the moment, the experience, the certainty of the cogito, and the exclusion of madness that this brings about. This danger will hover over Descartes' reflections right up until the establishment of the existence and truth of the external world. F. P. 196. One may imagine the effects that the category of the perpetual threat, Foucault's term, can have on indications of presence, positive markings, the determinations made by means of signs or statements, in short, the whole criteriology and symptomatology that can give assurance to a historical knowledge concerning a figure, an episteme, an age, an epoch, a paradigm, once all these determinations are found to be threatened, and perpetually so, perpetually disturbed by a haunting. In principle, all these determinations are, for the historian, either presences or absences. They exclude haunting. They allow themselves to be located by means of signs, one would almost say on a table of absences and presences. They come out of the logic of opposition, in this case, the logic of inclusion or exclusion, of the alternative between the inside and the outside, and so on. The perpetual threat, that is, the shadow of haunting, and haunting is, like the phantom or fiction of an evil genius, neither present nor absent, neither positive nor negative, neither inside nor outside, does not challenge only one thing or another, it threatens the logic that distinguishes between one thing and another, the very logic of exclusion or foreclosure, as well as the history that is founded upon this logic and its alternatives. What is excluded is, of course, never simply excluded, neither by the cogito nor by anything else, without this eventually returning, and that is what a certain psychoanalysis will have also helped us to understand. Let me leave undeveloped this general problem, however, in order to return to a certain regulated functioning in the references to psychoanalysis and to the name of Freud in the history of madness in the classical age. Let us consider the couple Nietzsche/Freud, this odd couple about which there is so much else to say. I have attempted this elsewhere, especially in the postcard, and precisely, justament, in relationship to beyond the pleasure principle. The affiliation or filiation of this couple reappears elsewhere. It is again at a filial limit, in the introduction to the third and final part, when the delirium of Rameau's nephew sets the tone or gives the key, just as the Cartesian cogito had, for a new arrangement or division, partition. The delirium of Rameau's nephew, writes Foucault, announces Freud and Nietzsche. Let us set aside all the questions that the concept of announcing might pose for the historian. Not by accident do they resemble those raised a moment ago by the concept of haunting. As soon as that which announces no longer completely belongs to a present configuration and already belongs to the future of another, its place, the taking place of its event, calls for another logic, it disturbs, in any case, the axiomatics of a history that places too much trust in the opposition between absence and presence, outside and inside, inclusion and exclusion. Let us read, then, this sentence and note the recurrence counts, and thus all the more striking association of this announcement with the figure of the evil genius, but, this time, with the figure of another evil genius. The delirium of Rameau's nephew is a tragic confrontation of need and illusion in an one-eric mode, one that announces Freud and Nietzsche. The order of names is this time reversed. It is also the ironic repetition of the world, its destructive reconstitution in the theater of illusion, f. p. 422. An evil genius then immediately reappears. And who will see this inevitable repetition as a coincidence? But it is not the same evil genius. It is another figure of the evil genius. There would thus be a recurring function of the evil genius, a function that, in making reference to a Platonic hyperbole, I called hyperbolic incogito and the history of madness. This function was fulfilled by the evil genius, under the guise as well as under the name that it takes on in Descartes. But another evil genius, which is also the same one, can reappear without this name and under a different guise, for example, in the vicinity or lineage of Rameau's nephew, a different evil genius, certainly, but bearing enough of a resemblance because of its recurring function that the historian, here Foucault, allows himself a metonymy that is legitimate enough in his eyes to continue calling it evil genius. This reapparition occurs after the second passage of Freud and Nietzsche, as they are furtively announced by Rameau's nephew, whose laugh prefigures in advance and reduces the whole movement of 19th century anthropology, f. p. 424. This time of prefiguration and announcement, this delay between the anticipatory lightning flash and the event of what is foreseen, is explained by the very structure of an experience of unreason, if there is any, namely, an experience in which one cannot maintain oneself and out of which one cannot but fall after having approached it. All this thus forbids our making this history into a properly successive and sequential history of events. This is formulated in Foucault's question, why is it not possible to maintain oneself in the difference of unreason? F. p. 425. But in this vertigo where the truth of the world is maintained only on the inside of an absolute void, man also encounters the ironic perversion of his own truth, at the moment when it moves from the dreams of interiority to the forms of exchange. Unreason then takes on the figure of another evil genius, my emphasis, no longer the one who exiles man from the truth of the world, but the one who at once mystifies and demystifies, enchants to the point of extreme disenchantment, this truth of man that man had entrusted to his hands, to his face, to his speech, an evil genius who no longer operates when man wants to accede to the truth but when he wants to restitute to the world a truth that is his own, when, thrown into the intoxication of the sensible realm where he is lost, he finally remains immobile, stupid, astonished. It is no longer in perception that the possibility of the evil genius resides, that is, as in Descartes, but in expression. F. p. 423. But immediately after this appearance or arraignment of Freud next to Nietzsche and all the evil geniuses, the pendulum of the Fortolder is put in motion. From this point on, it will not cease to convoke and dismiss Freud from the two sides of the dividing line, both inside and outside of the series that puts its signature to the history of madness. For it is here, in the following pages, that we find Freud separated from the lineage in which are gathered all those worthy heirs of Rameau's nephew. The name of the one who was not crazy enough in any case, the name of Freud, is dissociated from that of Nietzsche. It is regularly passed over in silence when, according to another filiation, Hölderlin, Nerval, Nietzsche, Van Gogh, Russell, and Artaud are at several reprieves named and renamed renowned within the same family. From this point on, things get worse. To do justice to Freud will more and more come to mean putting on trial a psychoanalysis that will have participated, in its own way, however original that may be, in the order of the immemorial figures of the father and the judge, of family and law, in the order, of authority and punishment, whose immemorial figures must, as Philippe Pinel noted, be brought into play by the doctor, in order to cure, seem, p. 272, f. p. 607. There was already a disturbing sign of this long before the chapter The Birth of the Asylum, which strictly inscribes psychoanalysis into the tradition of Tuke and Pinel and goes so far as to say that all 19th century psychiatry really converges on Freud, m. p. 277, f. p. 6n. Freud had already appeared in another chain, the chain of those who, since the 19th century, know that madness, like its counterpart reason, has a history. These will have even been led astray by a sort of historicism of reason and madness, a risk that is avoided by those who, from Chardet to Hölderlin, to Nerval and to Nietzsche are given over to a repeated poetic and philosophical experience and plunge into a language that abolishes history. Being a cultural historian of madness, as others are of reason, Freud thus appears between Janet and Brunswick, f. p. 456. While accumulating the two errors, Freud as rationalist historian of this cultural phenomenon called madness nonetheless continues to pay tribute to myth, magic, and thaumaturgy. Indeed, thaumaturgy will be the word chosen by Foucault himself for the verdict. There is nothing surprising in this collusion of reason and a certain occultism. Montaigne and Pascal would have perhaps called it mystical or secret authority. The history of reason and reason within history would exercise essentially the same violence, the same obscure, irrational, dictatorial violence, serving the same interests in the name of the same fictional allegation, as psychoanalysis does when it confers all powers to the doctor's speech. Freud would free the patient interned in the asylum only to reconstitute him in his essential character at the heart of the analytic situation. There is a continuity from Pinel and Tuke to psychoanalysis. There is an inevitable movement, right up to Freud, a persistence of what Foucault calls the myth of Pinel, like that of Tuke, f. p. 577. This insistence is always concentrated in the figure of the doctor. It is, in the eyes of the patient, who is always an accomplice, the becoming thaumaturge of a doctor who is not even supposed to know. Homo medicus does not exercise his authority in the name of science but, as Pinel himself seems to recognize and to claim, in the name of order, law, and morality, specifically, by relying upon that prestige that envelops the secrets of the family, of authority, of punishment, and of love, by wearing the mask of father and of judge, m. p. 273, f. pp. 607-8, my emphasis. 3 times the other secret of psychoanalysis, the mystical foundation of authority when the walls of the asylum give way to psychoanalysis, a certain concept of the secret maintains the tradition from Pinel to Freud. It would be necessary to follow throughout these pages all the ins and outs of the value itself barely visible of a secret, of a certain secrecy value. This value would come down, in the end, to a technique of the secret, and of the secret without knowledge. Wherever knowledge can only be supposed, wherever, as a result, one knows that supposition cannot give rise to knowledge, wherever no knowledge could ever be disputed, there is the invisible production, for no one ever witnesses it, of a secrecy effect, of what we might call a speculation on the capital secret or on the capital of the secret. The calculated and yet finally incalculable production of this secrecy effect relies on a simulacrum. This simulacrum recalls, from another point of view, the situation described at the opening of Raymond Russell, the risk of being deceived less by a secret than by the awareness that there is a secret. 13. What persists from Pinel to Freud, in spite of all the differences, is the figure of the doctor as a man not of knowledge but of order. In this figure all secret, magic, esoteric, thaumaturgical powers are brought together, and these are all Foucault's words. The scientific objectivity that is claimed by this tradition is only a magical reification. If we wanted to analyze the profound structures of objectivity in the knowledge and practice of 19th century psychiatry from Pinel to Freud, this is the definitive divorce between Nietzsche and Freud, the second coupling for the latter. We should have to show in fact that such objectivity was from the start a reification of a magical nature, which could only be accomplished with the complicity of the patient himself, and beginning from a transparent and clear moral practice, gradually forgotten as positivism imposed its myths of scientific objectivity. P 276, F. P 610. In the name of Freud, one can read the call for a note. At the bottom of the page, Foucault confirms, dates, and signs, but the note introduces a slight precaution. It is indeed a note of prudence, but Foucault insists nonetheless and speaks of persistence. These structures still persist in non-psychoanalytic psychiatry, and in many aspects or on many sides, par B. Endes quotes, of psychoanalysis itself, P 299, F. P 6 row. There is indeed a limit, though too discreetly marked, to what persists on many sides. The always divisible line of this limit situates, in its form, the totality of the stakes. More precisely, the stakes are nothing other than those of totality, and of the procedures of totalization. What does it mean to say psychoanalysis itself? What does one thereby identify in such a global way? Is it psychoanalysis itself, as Foucault says, that inherits from Pinel? What is psychoanalysis itself? And are the aspects or sides through which it inherits the essential and irreducible aspects or sides of psychoanalysis itself, or the residual sides that it can win out over, avoir raison de? Or even, that it must, that it should, win out over? If in this note the answer to this last question still seems up in the air, it will soon come in a more determined and less equivocal form. No, psychoanalysis will never free itself from the psychiatric heritage. Its essential historical situation is linked to what is called the analytic situation, that is, to the thaumaturgical mystification of the couple doctor-patient, regulated this time by institutional protocols. Before citing word for word a conclusion that will remain, I believe, without appeal not only in the history of madness but in Foucault's entire oeuvre right up to its awful interruption, I will once again abuse your patience in order to look for a moment at the way in which Foucault describes the thaumaturgical play whose techne Pinel would have passed down to Freud, a techne that would be at once art and technique, the secret of the secret that consists in knowing how to make one suppose knowledge and believe in the secret. It is worth pausing here in order to point out another paradoxical effect of the chiasmus, one of the most significant for what concerns us here, namely, a certain diabolical repetition and the recurrence of the various figures of the evil genius. What does Foucault say? That in the couple doctor-patient the doctor becomes a thaumaturge, B 275, F. B 609. Now, to describe this thaumaturgy, Foucault does not hesitate to speak of the demonic and satanic, as if the evil genius resided this time not on the side of unreason, of absolute disorder and madness, to say it quickly and with a bit of a smile, using all the necessary quotation marks, on the good side, but on the side of order, on the side of a subtly authoritative violence, the side of the father, the judge, the law, and so on. It was thought, and by the patient first of all, that it was in the esotericism of his knowledge, in some almost demonic secret of knowledge, I emphasize almost, Foucault will later say his relation to Freud surely being anything but simple, that the Philistine representation of mental illness in the 19th century would last right up to Freud, or almost, that the doctor had found the power to unravel insanity, and increasingly the patient would accept this self-surrender to a doctor both divine and satanic, beyond human measure in any case. P 275, F. P 609. 2 pages later, it is said that Freud amplified the thaumaturgical virtues of the medical personage preparing for his omnipotence a quasi-divine status. Foucault continues, he focused upon this single presence concealed behind the patient and above him, in an absence that is also a total presence, all the powers that had been distributed in the collective existence of the asylum. He transformed this into an absolute observation, a pure and circumspect silence, a judge who punishes and rewards in a judgment that does not even condescend to language. He made it the mirror in which madness, in an almost motionless movement, clings to and casts off its pound to the doctor. Freud transferred all the structures Pinel and Tuke had set up within confinement. BP 277-78, F. P6N, fictive omnipotence and a divine, or rather quasi-divine power, divine by simulacrum, at once divine and satanic. These are the very traits of an evil genius, which are now being attributed to the figure of the doctor. The doctor suddenly begins to resemble in a troubling way the figure of unreason that continued to haunt what is called the classical age after the act of force, coup de force, of the cogito. And like the authority of the laws whose mystical foundation is recalled by Montaigne and Pascal, 14, the authority of the psychoanalyst doctor is but the effect of a fiction. It proceeds, by transfer, from the credit given to a fiction, and this fiction appears analogous to that which provisionally confers all powers and even more than knowledge to the evil genius. At the conclusion of the birth of the asylum, Foucault dismisses without appeal this bad genius of the thaumaturgical doctor in the figure of the psychoanalyst. He does this, I believe one can say, without stretching the paradox against Descartes, against a certain Cartesian subject still represented in the filiation that runs from Descartes to Pinel to Freud. But he also does this, more or less willingly, as Descartes, or, at least, as the Descartes whom he had accused of excluding madness by excluding, mastering, or dismissing, since these all come down to the same things, powers of the evil genius. Against Freud, this descendant of Descartes, against Descartes, it is still the Cartesian exclusion that is repeated in a deadly and devilish way, like a heritage inscribed within a diabolical and almost all-powerful program that one should admit one never gets rid of or frees oneself from without remainder. To substantiate what I have just said, I will cite the conclusion of this chapter. It describes the transfer from Pinel to Freud, stroke of genius, masterful short circuit. It is a question of Freud's genius, the good like the bad, the good as bad, and it implacably judges psychoanalysis in the past, in the present, and even in the future. For psychoanalysis is condemned in advance. No future is promised to it that might allow it to escape its destiny once it has been determined both within the institutional, and supposedly inflexible, structure of what is called the analytic situation and in the figure of the doctor as subject. To the doctor, Freud transferred all the structures Pinel and Tuke had set up within confinement. He did deliver the patient from the existence of the asylum within which his liberators had alienated him, but he did not deliver him from what was essential in this existence. He regrouped its powers, extended them to the maximum by uniting them in the doctor's hands. He created the psychoanalytical situation where, by a masterful short circuit, court circuit genial, I underscore this allusion to the stroke of genius, coup de génie, which, as soon as it confirms the evil of confinement and of the interior asylum, is diabolical and properly evil, Mullin, and as we will see, for more than 20 years Foucault never stopped seeing in Freud, and quite literally so, sometimes a good and sometimes a bad or evil, mauvaise, genius. Alienation becomes disalienating because, in the Doctor, it becomes a subject. The Doctor, as an alienating figure, remains the key to psychoanalysis. It is perhaps because it did not suppress this ultimate structure, and because it referred all the others to it, that psychoanalysis has not been able, will not be able, I emphasize this future, it announces the invariability of this verdict in Foucault's subsequent work, to hear the voices of unreason, nor to decipher in themselves the signs of the madman. Psychoanalysis can unravel some of the forms of madness, it remains a stranger to the sovereign enterprise of unreason. It can neither liberate nor transcribe, nor most certainly explain, what is essential in this enterprise. p. 278, f. pp 6n12, and here, just after, are the very last lines of the chapter. We are far from the couple Nietzsche/Freud. They are now separated on both sides of what Foucault calls moral imprisonment, and it will always be difficult to say, in certain situations, who is to be found on the inside and who on the outside, and sometimes outside but inside. As opposed to Nietzsche and a few other great madmen, Freud no longer belongs to the space out of which the history of madness could be written. He belongs, rather, to the history of madness that the book makes its object. Since the end of the 18th century, the life of unreason no longer manifests itself except in the lightning flash of works such as those of Hölderlin, of Nerval, of Nietzsche, or of Artaud, forever irreducible to those alienations that can be cured, resisting by their own strength that gigantic moral imprisonment which we are in the habit of calling, doubtless by antiphrases, the liberation of the insane, aliens. By Pinel and Hugh. p. 278, f. p. 612. This diagnosis, which is also a verdict, is confirmed in the last chapter of the book, The Anthropological Circle. This chapter fixes the new distribution of names and places into the great series that form the grid of the book. When it comes to showing that since the end of the 18th century the liberation of the mad has been replaced by an objectification of the concept of their freedom, within such categories as desire and will, determinism and responsibility, the automatic and the spontaneous, and that one will now untiringly recount the trials and tribulations of freedom, which is also to say, of a certain humanization as anthropologization, Freud is then regularly included among the exemplary figures of this anthropologism of freedom. Foucault says, page after page, from Esquirol to Janet, as from Real to Freud or from Hugh to Jackson, f. p. 6r6, or again, from Esquirol to Freud, f. p. 617, or again from Esquirol and Precise right up to Janet, Euler, and Freud, f. p. 624. A slight yet troubling reservation comes just after to mitigate all these regroupings. It is yet another almost. Concerning general paralysis and neurosyphilis, Philistinism is everywhere, right up to Freud or almost, f. p. 626. The geosmatic effects multiply. Some 200 pages earlier, what inscribes both Freud and Nietzsche, like two accomplices of the same age, is the reopening of the dialogue with unreason, the lifting of the interdiction against language, the return to a proximity with madness. Yet it is precisely this, or, rather, the silent double and hypocritical simulacrum of this, the mask of this language, the same freedom now objectified, that separates Freud from Nietzsche. It is this that now makes them unable to associate or to be associated with one another from the two sides of a wall that is all the more insurmountable insofar as it consists of an asylum's partition, an invisible, interior, but eloquent partition, that of truth itself as the truth of man and his alienation. Foucault was able, much earlier, to say that Freudian psychoanalysis, to which one must be fair or do justice, is not a psychology as soon as it takes language into account. Now it is language itself that brings psychoanalysis back down to the status of a psychoanthropology of alienation. This language wherein man appears in madness as being other than himself, this alterity of dialectic that is always begun anew between the same and the other, revealing to man his truth in the babbling movement of alienation or madness. F. p. 631. As concerns dialectic and alienation or madness, as concerns everything, in fact, that happens in the circulation of this anthropological circle wherein psychoanalysis is caught up or held, one should pause a bit longer than Foucault did on a passage from Hegel's Encyclopedia. I am referring to the remark of 408 in which Hegel situates and deduces madness as a contradiction of the subject between the particular determination of self-feeling and the network of mediations that is called consciousness. Hegel makes in passing a spirited praise of Pinel. I do not understand why Foucault, in quickly citing this passage, replaces this praise for Pinel by an ellipsis. More important, Hegel also interprets madness as a certain evil genius, der böse genius, taking control in man. Foucault elliptically cites a short phrase in translation, Macorn genie, without remarking on it and without linking these few extraordinary pages of Hegel to the great dramaturgy of the evil genius that concerns us here. Let me be quite clear about this. My intention here is not at all to accuse or criticize Foucault, to say, for example, that he was wrong to confine Freud himself, in general, or psychoanalysis itself, in general, to this role and place, on the subject of Freud or psychoanalysis themselves and in general. I have in this form and place almost nothing to say or think, except perhaps that Foucault has some good arguments and that others would have some pretty good ones as well to oppose to his. It is also not my intention, however it may seem, to suggest that Foucault contradicts himself when he so firmly places the same Freud, in general, or the same psychoanalysis, in general, sometimes on one side and sometimes on the other of the dividing line, and always on the side of the evil genius who is found sometimes on the side of madness, sometimes on the side of its exclusion reappropriation, on the side of its confinement to the outside or the inside, with or without asylum walls. The contradiction is no doubt in the things themselves, so to speak. And we are in a region where the wrong, the being wrong or the doing someone wrong, would want to be more than ever on the side of a certain reason, on the side of what is called raison garde, it is, on the side of keeping one's cool, keeping one's head on the side, precisely, where one is right, a raison, and where being right, avoir raison, is to win out over or prove someone wrong, avoir raison de, with a violence whose subtlety, whose hyperdialectic and hyperchiasmatic resources cannot be completely formalized, that is, can no longer be dominated by metalanguage. Which means that we are always caught in the knots that are woven, before us and beyond us, by this powerful, all too powerful logic. The history of reason embedded in all these turbulent idioms, to prove someone wrong, donner tort, or to prove them right, donner raison, to be right, avoir raison, to be wrong, avoir tort, to win out over, avoir raison de, to do someone wrong, faire tort, and so on, is also the history of madness that Foucault wished to recount to us. The fact that he was caught up even before setting out, in the snares of this logic which he sometimes thematizes as having to do with a system of contradictions and antinomies whose coherence remains hidden, cannot be reduced to a fault or wrong on his part. F. p. 624. This does not mean, however, that we, without ever finding him to be radically wrong or at fault, have to subscribe a priori to all his statements. One would be able to master this entire problematic, assuming this were possible, only after having satisfactorily answered a few questions as innocent as what is reason, for example, or, more narrowly, what is the principle of reason? What does it mean to be right, avoir raison? What does it mean to be right or to prove someone right? Of what you donna raison. To be wrong, to prove someone wrong, or to do them wrong, of what donna you fair taught. You will forgive me here, I hope, for leaving these enigmas as they are. 4 times the stroke of genius, a tireless thought, though I will restrict myself to a modest and more accessible question. The distribution of statements, as it appears to be set out before us, should lead us to think two apparently incompatible things. The book entitled The History of Madness, like the history of madness itself, is and is not the same age as Freudian psychoanalysis. The project of this book does and does not belong to the age of psychoanalysis. It already belongs to it and already no longer belongs to it. This division without division would put us back on the track of another logic of division, one that would urge us to think the internal partitions of wholes, partitions that would make such things as madness, reason, history, and age, especially the whole we call age but also psychoanalysis, Freud, and so on, into rather dubious identities, sufficiently divided from within to threaten in advance all our statements and all our references with parasitism. It would be a bit as if a virus were introduced into the matrix of language, the way such things are today introduced into computer software, the difference being that we are, and for a very good reason, very far from having at our disposal any of the diagnostic and remedial antiviral programs that are available on the market today, even though these programs, and for a very good reason, have a hard time keeping pace with the industrial production of these viruses, which are themselves sometimes produced by those who produce the intercepting programs. A maddening situation to do justice to Freud 101 for any discourse, certainly, but a certain mad panic is not necessarily the worst thing that can happen to a discourse on madness as soon as it does not go all out to confine or exclude its object, that is, in the sense Foucault gives to this word, to objectify it. Does one have the right to stop here and be content with this as an internal reading of Foucault's great book? Is an internal reading possible? Is it legitimate to privilege to this extent its relation to something like an age of psychoanalysis itself? The reservations that such presumptions of identity might arouse, the unity of an age, the indivisibility of psychoanalysis itself, and so on, and I've made more than one allusion to them, would be enough to make us question this. One could justify a response to this question only by continuing to read and to analyze, by continuing to take into account in particular Foucault's corpus, his archive, what this archive says on the subject of the archive. Without limiting ourselves to this, think of the problems posed some 5 to 8 years later. 1. By the order of things concerning something that has always seemed enigmatic to me and that Foucault calls for a time episteme, there where it is said, we think in that place, OT, p. 384, MC, p. 396, a place that, and I will return to this in a moment, encompasses or comprehends the psychoanalysis that does not comprehend it, or more precisely, that comprehends it without comprehending it. And without acceding to it. 2. By the archaeology of knowledge concerning the historical a priori and the archive, the title of a central chapter, and archaeology in its relation to the history of ideas. It is out of the question to get involved here in such difficult readings. I will thus be content to conclude, if you will still allow me, with a few indications, 2 at the most, along one of the paths I would have wanted to follow in these readings. 1. The pendulum, death, and us. On the one hand, I would have tried to identify the signs of an imperturbable constancy in the movement of the pendulum or balance. The oscillation regularly leads from one topological assignation to the other, as if psychoanalysis had 2 places or took place 2 times at the same time. Yet it seems to me that the law of this displacement operates without the structural possibility of an event or a place being analyzed for itself, and without the consequences being drawn with regard to the identity of all the concepts at work in this history that does not want to be a history of ideas and representations. This constancy in the oscillation of the pendulum is first marked, of course, in books that are more or less contemporary with the history of madness. Malay Mentale Psychology, Mental Illness and Psychology, 1962, intersects and coincides at many points with the history of madness. In the history of mental illness, Freud appears as the first to open up once again the possibility for reason and unreason to communicate in the danger of a common language, ever ready to break down and disintegrate into the inaccessible. MJ, p. 69, mm, p. 82. In truth, though profoundly in accord with the movement and logic of the history of madness, this book of 1962 is, in the end, a bit more precise and differentiated in its references to Freud, although beyond the pleasure principle is never mentioned. Foucault speaks both of Freud's stroke of genius, this is indeed his word, and of the dividing line that runs through his work. Freud's stroke of genius was to have escaped the evolutionist horizon of John Houlings Jackson, MJ, p. 31, mm, p. 37, whose model can nevertheless be found in the description of the evolutionary forms of neurosis and the history of libidinal stages. 15. The libido being mythological, a myth to destroy, often a biopsychological myth that is abandoned, Foucault then thinks, by psychoanalysts, just as mythological as Janet's psychic force with which Foucault associates it more than once. MJ, p. 24, mm, p. 29. 16. If the assignation of Freud is thus double, it is because his work is divided. In psychoanalysis, it is always possible, says Foucault, to separate that which pertains to a psychology of evolution, as in 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, and that which belongs to a psychology of individual history, as in 5 psychoanalyses and the accompanying texts. MJ, p. 31, mm, p. 37. Despite this consideration for the stroke of genius, Foucault is speaking here of an analytic psychology. This is what he calls it. Insofar as it remains a psychology, it remains speechless before the language of madness. Indeed, there is a very good reason why psychology can never master madness. It is because psychology became possible in our world only when madness had already been mastered and excluded from the drama. Me, p. 87, mm, p. 104, a few lines before the end of the book. The excess of mastery ruins mastery. In other words, the logic at work in this conclusion, whose ruinous consequences one would ceaselessly have to take into account, is that what has already been mastered can no longer be mastered, and that too much mastery, in the form of exclusion but also of objectification, deprives one of mastery, in the form of access, knowledge, competence. The concept of mastery is an impossible concept to manipulate, as we know, the more there is, the less there is, and vice versa. The conclusion drawn in the few lines I just cited thus excludes both Freud's stroke of genius and psychology, be it analytic or some other. Freudian man remains a homo psychologicus. Freud is once again passed over in silence, cut out of both the lineage and the work of mad geniuses. He is sent back to oblivion, where one can then accuse him of silence and forgetting. And when enlightening flashes and cries, madness reappears, as in Nerval or Artaud, Nietzsche or Russell, it is psychology that remains silent, speechless. Foucault's emphasis, before this language that borrows a meaning of its own from that tragic split, I emphasize this phrase, this is a tragic and romantic discourse on the essence of madness and the birth of tragedy, a discourse just as close, literally, to that of a certain novelist as to that of Hölderlin, from that freedom that, for contemporary man, only the existence of psychologists allows him to forget. MJ, pp 87 to 88, mm, p 104, 17 and yet. Still according to the interminable and inexhaustible thought. though, which we have been following for some time now. The same Freudian man is reinscribed into the noble lineage at the end of Nicen's Der F.A. Clinic, The Birth of the Clinic, a book published in 1963 but clearly written out of the same impulse. Why single out this occurrence of the reinscription rather than another? Because it might give us, this is the hypothesis that interests me, a rule for reading this fortolder. It might provide us with a criterion for interpreting this untiring exclusion/inclusion. It is a question of another divide within psychoanalysis, a divide that seems somewhat different from the one I spoke of a moment ago between Freud the psychologist of evolution and Freud the psychologist of individual history. I say seems somewhat different because the one perhaps leads back to the other. The line of this second divide is, quite simply if one can say this, death. The Freud who breaks with psychology, with evolutionism and biologism, the tragic Freud, really, who shows himself hospitable to madness, and I risk this word, because he is foreign to the space of the hospital. The tragic Freud who deserves hospitality in the great lineage of mad geniuses, is the Freud who talks it out with death. This would especially be the Freud, then, of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, although Foucault never, to my knowledge, mentions this work and makes only a very ambiguous allusion in mental illness and psychology to what he calls a death instinct, the one by which Freud wished to explain the war, although it was war that was dreamed in this shift in Freud's thinking, ML, p. 83, mm, p. 99. Death alone, along with war, introduces the power of the negative into psychology and into its evolutionist optimism. On the basis of this experience of death, on the basis of what is called in the final pages of The Birth of the Clinic origin finitude 18, a vocabulary and theme that then take over Foucault's text and that always seemed to me difficult to dissociate from Heidegger, who as you know is practically never evoked, or even named, by Foucault. 19 Freud is reintegrated into the modernity out of which the history of madness is written and from which he had been banished at regular intervals. It is by taking account of death as the concrete a priori of medical experience that the beginning of that fundamental relation that binds modern man to his origin finitude comes about. B. pp 196, 197, n. pp 198, 199. This modern man is also a Freudian man. The experience of individuality in modern culture is bound up with that of death. From Holderlin's Empedon to do justice to Freud 105 Des to Nietzsche's Zarathustra, and on to Freudian man. My emphasis, an obstinate relation to death prescribes to the universal its singular face, and lends to each individual the power of being heard forever. B. P 197, n. P 199. Origin finitude is a finitude that no longer arises out of the infinity of a divine presence. It now unfolds in the void left by the absence of the gods. B. P 198, n. P 200. What we have here, then, is, in the name of death, so to speak, a reinscription of Freudian man into a modern grouping or whole from which he was sometimes excluded. One can then follow two new but equally ambiguous consequences. On the one hand, the grouping in question will be restructured. One should not be surprised to see reappear, as on the very last page of The Birth of the Clinic, the name of Jackson and, before him, Bicart, whose trait des membranes, 1827, and Recherches physiologiques would have allowed death to be seen and thought. This vitalism would have arisen against the backdrop of mortalism, p. 145, n. p. 147. It would be a characteristic of the entire European 19th century, and it could be attested to just as well by Goya, Géricault, Delacroix, or Baudelaire, to name a few. The importance of Bicart, Jackson, and Freud in European culture does not prove that they were philosophers as well as doctors, but that, in this culture, medical thought is fully engaged in the philosophical status of man. B. P 198, n. P 200. But there is a second ambiguous consequence of this relation to death as origin finitude. And so, on the other hand, the figure or face that is then fixed, and in which one believes one recognizes the traits of Freudian man comes to occupy a rather singular place with respect to what Foucault calls the analytic of finitude and the modern episteme at the end of Les Marx et les Choses, The Order of Things, 1966. From the standpoint of a certain epistemological trihedron, life, work, and language, or biology, economy, and philology, the human sciences are seen to be at once inclusive and exclusive. These are Foucault's words, COT, p. 347, MC, p. 358. As for this inclusive exclusion, Freud's work, to which Foucault unwaveringly assigns a model that is more philological than biological, still occupies the place of the hinge. Foucault in fact speaks about the place and workings of a pivot, all this knowledge, within which Western culture had given itself in one century a certain image of man, pivots, my emphasis, on the work of Freud, though without, for all that, leaving its fundamental arrangement, OT, p. 36R, MC, p. 372. Though without, for all that, leaving its fundamental arrangement, that is how everything turns round the event or the invention of psychoanalysis. It turns in circles and in place, endlessly returning to the same. It is a revolution that changes nothing. Hence this is not, as Foucault adds at this point, the most decisive importance of psychoanalysis. In what, then, does this most decisive importance of psychoanalysis consist? In exceeding both consciousness and representation and, as a result, the human sciences, which do not go beyond the realm of the representable. It is in this respect that psychoanalysis, like ethnology, in fact, does not belong to the field of the human sciences. It relates the knowledge of man to the finitude that gives man its foundation, OT, p. 381, MC, p. 392. We are far from its earlier determination as an analytic psychology. This excessive character leads psychoanalysis toward the forms of finitude that Foucault writes in capital letters, that is, toward death, desire, law or law language, COT, p. 375, MC, p. 386. It would be necessary to devote a more detailed and more probing reading to these few pages, something I cannot do here. To keep to the surest schema, let us simply say that, from this point of view and at least to this degree, psychoanalysis, as an analytic of finitude, is now granted an intimacy with the madness that it had sometimes been conceded but had most often been emphatically denied in the history of madness. And this intimacy is a sort of complicity with the madness of the day, the madness of today, madness in its present form, madness as it is posited in the modern experience, as its truth and its alterity, OT, p. 375, MC, p. 387. But let us not oversimplify things. What Foucault generously grants psychoanalytic experience is now nothing other than what is denied it. More precisely, it sees itself given over to what is denied to it. Indeed, the only privilege that is here granted to psychoanalysis is that of the experience that accedes to that to which it can never accede. If Foucault here mentions, under the name of madness, only schizophrenia and psychosis, it is because psychoanalysis most often approaches these only in order to acknowledge its own limit, a forbidden or impossible access. This limit defines psychoanalysis. Its intimacy with madness par excellence is an intimacy with the least intimate, a non-intimacy that relates it to what is most heterogeneous, to that which in no way lets itself be interiorized, nor even subjectified, neither alienated, I would say, nor inalienable. This is why psychoanalysis finds in that madness par excellence. Madness par excellence is also the title given by Blancotte many years earlier to a text on Holderlin, and Foucault is no doubt echoing this without saying so, which psychiatrists term schizophrenia its intimate, its most invincible torture, for, given in this form of madness, in an absolutely manifest and absolutely withdrawn form, this absolute identity of the manifest and the withdrawn, of the open and the secret, is no doubt the key to this double gesture of interpretation and evaluation, are the forms of finitude towards which it usually advances unceasingly, and interminably, from the starting point of that which is involuntarily offered to it in the patient's language. So psychoanalysis recognizes itself when it is confronted with those very psychoses to which, nevertheless, or rather, for that very reason, it has scarcely any means of access, as if the psychosis were displaying in a savage illumination, and offering in a mode not too distant but precisely too close, that towards which analysis must make its laborious way. OT, pp 375-76, MC, p 387. This displacement, as ambiguous as it is, leads Foucault to adopt the exact opposite position of certain theses of the history of madness and mental illness and psychology concerning the couple patient-doctor, concerning transference or alienation. This time, psychoanalysis not only has nothing to do with the psychology, but it constitutes neither a general theory of man since it is above all else a knowledge linked to a practice nor an anthropology. COT, pp 376, 378-79, MC, pp 388, 390. Even better, in the movement where he clearly affirms this, Foucault challenges the very thing of which he had unequivocally accused psychoanalysis, namely, of being a mythology and a thaumaturgy. He now wants to explain why psychologists and philosophers were so quick, and so naive, to denounce a Freudian mythology there where that which exceeds representation and consciousness must have in fact resembled, but only resembled, something mythological. COT, p 374, MC, p 386. As for the thaumaturgy of transference, the logic of alienation, and the subtly or sublimely asylum-like violence of the analytic situation, they are no longer, Foucault now says, essential to psychoanalysis, no longer constitutive of it. It is not that all violence is absent from this rehabilitative psychoanalysis, but it is, I hardly dare say it, a good violence, or in any case what Foucault calls a calm violence, one that, in the singular experience of singularity, allows access to the concrete figures of finitude. Neither hypnosis, nor the patient's alienation within the phantasmatic character of the doctor, is constitutive of psychoanalysis. The latter can be deployed only in the calm violence of a particular relationship, rapport singulier, and the transference it produces. Psychoanalysis makes use of the particular relation, rapport singulier, of the transference in order to reveal, on the outer confines of representation, desire, law, and death, which outline, at the extremity of analytic language and practice, the concrete figures of finitude. OT, pp 377-78, MC, pp 388-89, things have indeed changed also it appears between the history of madness and the order of things. Whence comes the theme of finitude that seems to govern this new displacement of the pendulum? To what philosophical event is this analytic of finitude to be attributed, this analytic in which is inscribed the trihedron of knowledge or models of the modern episteme, with its nonsciences, the human sciences according to Foucault, OT, p 366, MC, p 378, and its counter-sciences which Foucault says psychoanalysis and ethnology also are, OT, p 379, MC, p 391. As a project, the analytic of finitude would belong to the trady to do justice to Freud 109 of the Kantian critique. Foucault insists on this Kantian filiation by specifying, to cite it once again, we think in that place. Here is again and for a time, according to Foucault, our age, our contemporaneity. It is true that if originary finitude obviously makes us think of Kant, it would be unable to do so alone, that is to summarize an enormous venture in a word, in a name without the active interpretation of the Heideggerian repetition and all its repercussions, particularly, since this is our topic today, in the discourse of French philosophy and psychoanalysis, and especially, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and when I say Lacanian, I am also referring to all the debates with Lacan during the past few decades. This would have perhaps deserved some mention here on the part of Foucault, especially when he speaks of originary finitude. For Kantian finitude is precisely not originary as is, on the contrary, the one to which the Heideggerian interpretation leads. Finitude in Kant's sense is instead derived, as is the intuition bearing the same name. But let us leave all this aside, since it would, as we say, take us a bit too far afield. The we who is saying we think in that place is evidently, tautologically, the we out of which the signatory of these lines, the author of the history of madness and the order of things, speaks, writes, and thinks. But this we never stops dividing, and the places of its signature are displaced in being divided up. A certain untimeliness always disturbs the contemporary who reassures him or herself in a we. This we is not its own contemporary. The self-identity of its age, or of any age, appears as divided, and thus problematic. Problemate is able, I underscore this word for a reason that will perhaps become apparent in a moment, as the age of madness or an age of psychoanalysis as well as, in fact, all the historical or archaeological categories that promise us the determinable stability of a configurable whole. Moreover, from the moment a couple separates, from the moment, for example, just to locate here a symptom or a simple indication, the couple Freud /Nietzsche forms and then unforms, this decoupling fissures the identity of the epoch, of the age, of the episteme of the paradigm of which one or the other, or both together, might have been the signifiers or representatives. This is even more true when this decoupling comes to fissure the self-identity of some individual, or some presumed individuality, for example, of Freud. What allows one to presume the non-self difference of Freud, for example, and of psychoanalysis? These decouplings and self-differences no doubt introduce a good deal of disorder into the unity of any configuration, whole, epoch, or historical age. Such disturbances make the historian's work rather uncomfortable, even and especially the work of the most original and refined among them. This self-difference, this difference to self, as soi, and not simply with self, makes life hard if not impossible for historical science. But inversely, would there be any history, would anything ever happen, without this principle of disturbance? Would there ever be any event without this disturbance of the principality? At the point where we are, the age of finitude is being identified for at least one reason, from which I can here only abstract the general schema. The thought of finitude, as the thought of finite man, speaks both of the tradition, the memory of the Kantian critique or of the knowledge rooted in it, and of the end, fin, of this finite man, this man who is nearing its end as Foucault's most famous sentence would have it in this final wager, placed on the edge of a promise that has yet to take shape, in the final lines of the order of things, then one can certainly wager that man would be effaced, like a face drawn in sand at the edge or limit of the sea. OT, p 387, MC, p 398. The tray of the face, the line or the limit, that then runs the risk of being effaced in the sand would perhaps also be the one that separates an end from itself, thereby multiplying it endlessly and making it, once again, into a limit. The self-relation of a limit at once erases and multiplies the limit, it cannot but divide it in inventing it. The limit only comes to be effaced, it only comes to efface itself as soon as it is inscribed. To Freud's evil good genius. I'm finished with this point, and so I should really finish it up right here. Assuming that I haven't already worn out your patience, I will conclude with a second indication as a sort of postscript and even more schematically in order to point once again in the direction of psychoanalysis and to put these hypotheses to the test of the history of sexuality, 1976 to 1984. 20. If one is still willing to follow this figure of the pendulum, balance sire, making a scene in front of psychoanalysis, then one will observe that the fort. The here gives a new impetus to the movement, a movement with the same rhythm but with a greater amplitude and range than ever before. Psychoanalysis is here reduced to a very circumscribed and dependent moment in a history of the strategies of knowledge and power, juridical, familial, psychiatric, HS, p. 159, vs. p. 210. Psychoanalysis is taken by and interested in these strategies, but it does not think them through. The praises of Freud fall decisively and irreversibly. One hears, for example, of how wonderfully effective he was, worthy of the greatest spiritual fathers and directors of the classical period in giving a new impetus to the secular injunction to study sex and transform it into discourse, HS, p. 159, vs. p. 210. This time, in other words, in reinscribing the invention of psychoanalysis into the history of a disciplinary dynamic, one no longer indicts only the ruses of objectivization and psychiatric alienation, as in the history of madness, and no longer only the stratagems that would have allowed the confinement without confinement of the patient in the invisible asylum of the analytic situation. This time, it is a question of going much further back, and more radically than the repressive hypothesis ever did, toward the harsh ruses of the monarchy of sex and the effect of power that supports it. This effect invests in and takes charge of sexuality, so that there is no need to oppose, as one so often and naively believes, power and pleasure. Since we have been following for so long now the obsessive avatars of the evil genius, the irresistible, demonic, and metamorphic returns of this quasi-god, of God's second in command, this metempsychotic Satan, we here find Freud himself once again, Freud, to whom Foucault leaves a choice between only two roles, the bad genius and the good one. What we have here is another chiasmus, in the rhetoric of the few lines that I will read in a moment. One is not surprised to see that the accused, the one who is most directly targeted by the indictment, for no matter how much we deny it, we cannot forget that we are dealing here with a trial and the verdict is the good genius of Freud and not his bad genius. Why so? In the final pages of the first volume of the History of Sexuality, the accusation of pansexualism, which was often leveled against psychoanalysis, naturally comes up. Those most blind in this regard, says Foucault, were not those who denounced pansexualism out of prudishness. Their only error was to have attributed solely to the bad genius, mauvaise génie, of Freud what had already gone through a long stage of preparation, HS, p. 159, vs. p. 210, my emphasis. The opposite error, the symmetrical lure, corresponds to a more serious mystification. It is the illusion that could be called emancipatory, the aberration of the Enlightenment, the misguided notion on the part of those who believed that Freud, the good genius of Freud, had finally freed sex from its repression by power. These were mistaken concerning the nature of the process. They believed that Freud had at last, through a sudden reversal, restored to sex the rightful share which it had been denied for so long. They had not seen how the good genius of Freud had placed it at one of the critical points marked out for it since the 18th century by the strategies of knowledge and power, how wonderfully effective he was in giving a new impetus to the secular injunction to study sex and transform it into discourse. HS, p. 159, vs. p. 210, my emphasis. 21. The good genius of Freud would thus be worse than the bad one. It would have consisted in getting itself well placed, in spotting the best place in an old strategy of knowledge and power. 5 times problems whatever questions it might leave unanswered, and I will speak in just a moment of one it inspires in me. This project appears nonetheless exciting, necessary, and courageous. I would not want any particular reservation on my part to be too quickly classified among the reactions of those who hasten to defend the threatened privilege of the pure invention of psychoanalysis, that is, of an invention that would be pure, of a psychoanalysis that one might still dream would have innocently sprung forth already outfitted, helmeted, armed, in short, outside all history, after the epistemological cutting of the cord, as one used to say, indeed, after the unraveling of the navel of the dream. Foucault himself, during an interview, seemed to be ready for some sort of compromise on this issue, readily and good-spiritedly acknowledging the impasses. This was his word, of his concept of episteme and the difficulties into which this new project had led him. 22. But only those who work, only those who take risks in working, encounter difficulties. One only ever thinks and takes responsibility if indeed one ever does by undergoing the aporia. Without this, one is content to follow an inclination or apply a program. And it would not be very generous, indeed it would be especially naive and imprudent, to take advantage of these avowals, to take them literally, and to forget what Foucault himself tells us about the confessional scene. The question that I would have liked to formulate would thus aim neither to protect psychoanalysis against some new attack nor to cast the slightest doubt upon the importance, necessity, and legitimacy of Foucault's extremely interesting project concerning this great history of sexuality. My question would only seek, and this would be, in sum, a sort of modest contribution to complicate somewhat an axiomatic and, on the basis of this, perhaps, certain discursive or conceptual procedures, particularly regarding the way in which this axiomatic is inscribed in its age, in the historical field that serves as a point of departure, and in its reference to psychoanalysis. In a word, without compromising in the least the necessity of reinscribing almost all psychoanalysis, assuming one could seriously say such a thing, which I do not believe one can, psychoanalysis itself, all psychoanalysis, the whole truth about all psychoanalysis, into a history that precedes and exceeds it, it would be a question of becoming interested in certain gestures, in certain works, in certain moments of certain works of psychoanalysis, Freudian and post-Freudian, for one cannot, especially in France, seriously treat this subject by limiting oneself to a strictly Freudian discourse and apparatus, in certain traits of a consequently non-globalizable psychoanalysis, one that is divided and multiple, like the powers that Foucault ceaselessly reminds us are essentially dispersed. It would then be a question of admitting that these necessarily fragmentary or disjointed movements say and do, provide resources for saying and doing, what the history of sexuality, the will to knowledge, wishes to say, what it means, view dire, and what it wishes to do, to know and to make known, with regard to psychoanalysis. In other words, if one still wanted to speak in terms of age, something that I would only ever do in the form of citation at this point, here on this line, concerning some trait that is on the side out of which the history of sexuality is written rather than on the side of what it describes or objectifies, one would have to say that Foucault's project in its possibility belongs too much to the age of psychoanalysis for it, when claiming to themate psychoanalysis, to do anything other than let psychoanalysis continue to speak obliquely of itself and to mark one of its folds in a scene that I will not call self-referential or specular but whose structural complication I will not here try to describe. I have tried to do this elsewhere. This is not only because of what withdraws this history from the regime of representation, because of what already inscribes the possibility of this history in and after the age of Freud and Heidegger to use these names as mere indications for the sarcasm of convenience. It is also for a reason that interests us here more directly, what Foucault announces and denounces about the relation between pleasure and power, in what he calls the double impetus, pleasure and power, HS, p. 45, vs. p. 62, would find, already in Freud, to say nothing of those who followed, discussed, transformed, and displaced him, the very resources for the objection leveled against the good genius, the so very bad good genius of the father of psychoanalysis. I will situate this with just a word in order to conclude. Foucault clearly cautioned us, this history of sexuality was not to be a historian's history. A genealogy of desiring man was to be neither a history of representations nor a history of behaviors or sexual practices. This would lead one to think that sexuality cannot become an object of history without seriously affecting the historian's practice and the concept of history. Moreover, Foucault puts quotation marks around the word sexuality. The quotation marks have a certain importance, he adds. 23 We are thus also dealing here with the history of a word, with its usages starting in the 19th century and the reformulation of the vocabulary in relation to a large number of other phenomena, from biological mechanisms to traditional and new norms, to the institutions that support these, be they religious, juridical, pedagogical, or medical, for example, psychoanalytic. This history of the uses of a word is neither nominalist nor essentialist. It concerns procedures and, more precisely, zones of problematization. It is a history of truth as a history of problematizations, and even as an archaeology of problematizations through which being offers itself as something that can and must be thought. 24 The point is to analyze not simply behaviors, ideas, or ideologies but, above all, the problematizations in which a thought of being intersects practices and practices of the self, a genealogy of practices of the self through which these problematizations are formed. With its reflexive vigilance and care in thinking itself in its rigorous specificity, such an analysis thus calls for the problematization of its own problematization. And this must itself also question itself, with the same archaeological and genealogical care, the same care that it itself methodically prescribes. When confronted with a historical problematization of such scope and thematic richness, one should not be satisfied either with a mere survey, or with asking in just a few minutes an overarching question so as to ensure some sort of synoptic mastery. What we can and must try to do in such a situation is to pay tribute to a work that is this great and this uncertain by means of a question that it itself raises, by means of a question that it carries within itself, that it keeps in reserve in its unlimited potential, one of the questions that can thus be deciphered within it, a question that keeps it in suspense, holding its breath, and, thus, keeps it alive. For me one of these questions, for example, would be the one I tried to formulate a few years ago during a conference honoring Foucault at New York University. 25 It was developed by means of a problematization of the concept of power and of the theme of what Foucault calls the spiral in the duality power/pleasure. Leaving aside the huge question of the concept of power and of what gives it its alleged unity under the essential dispersion rightly recalled by Foucault himself, I will pull out only a thread. It would lead to that which, in a certain Freud and at the center of a certain French heritage of Freud, would not only never let itself be objectified by the Foucauldian problematization but would actually contribute to it in the most determinate and efficient way, thereby deserving to be inscribed on the thematizing rather than on the thematized border of this history of sexuality. I wonder what Foucault would have said, in this perspective and were he to have taken this into account, not of Freud or of psychoanalysis itself in general which does not exist any more than power does as one big central and homogeneous corpus but, for example, since this is only one example, about an undertaking like beyond the pleasure principle, about something in its lineage or between its filial connections along with everything that has been inherited, repeated, or discussed from it. Since then, in following one of these threads or filial connections, one of the most discreet, in following the abyssal, unassignable, and unmasterable strategy of this text, a strategy that is finally without strategy, one begins to see that this text not only opens up the horizon of a beyond of the pleasure principle, the hypothesis of such a beyond never really seeming to be of interest to Foucault, against which the whole economy of pleasure needs to be rethought, complicated, pursued in its most unrecognizable ruses and detours. By means of one of these filiations another one unwinding the spool of the thought, that continues to interest us this text also problematizes, in its greatest radicality, the agency of power and mastery. In a discreet and difficult passage, an original drive for power or drive for mastery, Bemächtigungstrieb, is mentioned. It is very difficult to know if this drive for power is still dependent upon the pleasure principle, indeed, upon sexuality as such, upon the austere monarchy of sex that Foucault denounces on the last page of his book. How would Foucault have situated this drive for mastery in his discourse on power or on irreducibly plural powers? How would he have read this drive, had he read it, in this extremely enigmatic text of Freud? How would he have interpreted the recurring references to the demonic from someone who then makes himself, according to his own terms, the devil's advocate and who becomes interested in the hypothesis of a late or derived appearance of sex and sexual pleasure? In the whole problematization whose history he describes, how would Foucault have inscribed this passage from beyond the pleasure principle, and this concept and these questions, with all the debates to which this book of Freud either directly or indirectly gave rise, in a sort of over-determining capitalization, particularly in the France of our age, beginning with everything in Lacan that takes its point of departure in the repetition compulsion, wider whole and swang? Would he have inscribed this problematic matrix within the whole whose history he describes? Or would he have put it on the other side, on the side of what allows one, on the contrary, to delimit the whole, indeed to problematize it? And thus on a side that no longer belongs to the whole, nor, I would be tempted to think, to any whole, such that the very idea of a gathering of problematization or procedure, dispositive, to say nothing any longer of age, episteme, paradigm, or epoch, would make for so many problematic names, just as problematic as the very idea of problematization. This is one of the questions that I would have liked to ask him. I am trying, since this is, unfortunately, the only recourse left us in the solitude of questioning, to imagine the principle of the reply. It would perhaps be something like this: what one must stop believing in is principality or principalness, in the problematic of the principle, in the principled unity of pleasure and power, or of some drive that is thought to be more originary than the other. The theme of the spiral would be that of a drive duality, power I pleasure, that is without principle. Is not what Freud was looking for, under the names death drive and repetition compulsion that which, coming before the principle, of pleasure or reality, would remain forever heterogeneous to the principle of principle. It is the spirit of this spiral that keeps one in suspense, holding one's breath and, thus, keeps one alive. The question would thus once again be given a new impetus: is not the duality in question, this spiral duality, what Freud tried to oppose to all monisms by speaking of a dual drive and of a death drive that was no doubt not alien to the drive for mastery? And, thus, to what is most alive in life, to its very living on, survivance. I am still trying to imagine Foucault's response. I can't quite do it. I would have so much liked for him to take it on himself, but in this place where no one now can answer for him, in the absolute silence where we remain nonetheless turned toward him, I would venture to wager that, in a sentence that I will not construct for him, he would have associated and yet also dissociated, he would have sent them packing back to back, mastery and death, that is, the same death and the master, death as the master.